Record. Okay, real estate calculations. We'll do this kind of quick. I know our breaks are funky. Page 80 is where calculations start. Now, keep in mind, you've got 5 calculations on the exam. You will have none on the state version. You'll have these only on the national. And you've got 2 hours to do 80 questions. So you really have plenty of time to answer questions and then maybe even spend 20 to 25 minutes just on the math if you really wanted to dive in and spend some time. So you really do have plenty of time. Don't worry about that. Remember, you've got that piece of scratch paper if you're going to the test center, and you can borrow a calculator. If you're testing from home with a proctor, you will not have scratch paper, and the calculator will be built into the program. My student feedback, though, is they got along just fine without the scratch paper. So take that for what it's worth. I glean as much as I can when I ask students about their experience. 80% of the time when I ask students for feedback, they say, I don't remember what the hell happened. I just know I passed. I don't care. Their brain just leaves their body about the experience, right? Yep, it's gone. So that is the feedback, though, that I have gotten, that they were able to get through it without having that scratch paper. If you are going to a live test center where they've got the scratch paper, don't forget that a piece of paper has 2 sides. Love you. You can turn that over if you need to. Just don't have a brain moment and forget that that is technically a 3D item you could turn over and use the back side. Now, I'm going to hit what I think are the highlights, even though I think you've got more in here. I think of your 5 test questions, the most important place for you to spend your time is under financing calculations. Page 81 is where we start this with loan to value. Loan to value is calculating the amount that the borrower is bringing as a down payment and the amount that they're borrowing from the bank. Those 2 things put together are going to equal the purchase price that they agreed to give to the seller. Now, that loan to value can be a percentage or it could be dollar amounts, meaning a 90% loan to value of $100,000. That means that they're borrowing 90%, they're putting 10% down, or they're bringing 90,000, they're bringing 10,000 to put down. But $100,000 is the amount on the contract with the seller. The other layer I want to remind you with all of this financing stuff is the lender calculates the numbers off of either the purchase price or the appraised value, whichever is less. The assessed value doesn't matter. The rebuild cost doesn't matter. What it's insured for, those don't matter. The lender is looking at appraised or purchase price, whichever is less. So if the purchase price is $100,000 and it appraises at $100,000, there's your number. If it appraises for 110, but the purchase price is 100, 100 on the purchase agreement is your number. If the purchase price is 100,000 and it appraises for 95,000, now 95,000 is the number the lender calculates everything off of, which essentially would leave your buyer to bring the difference to make the seller whole and fulfill that contract. Okay. So that's the idea for financing calculations. For purchase price and down payment, we've got an example at the bottom of page 81 that's $180,000 with a $9,000 down payment. My way of calculating that, and I know that there's other ways, is to take 9,000 divided by 180,000. Little number divided by the big number. And that's going to give you a number of 0.05 or 5%. So we're putting 5% down, leaving our loan to value to be 95%. Those two put together are 100% of what we owe the seller. The next concept was debt to income ratio. This is on page 82 in the middle. And what I found about debt to income ratio is that they usually are using percentages of 28 and 36%. Now, it will give you those numbers in the test question if you get this. But my experience on the exam and any other study materials I've invested in has always been those numbers. That may not be true to a real loan, but we're going to roll with it. One of those numbers, the 36%, represents the total amount of debt you can have based off of your gross monthly income. Gross monthly income. 36% of it, that's the total debt you can carry. Your revolving debt that you make periodic payments, such as car payments, student loans, credit card payments. And that 36% also includes what you can afford for your house payment, PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, that payment. Total debt is 36%. 28% in these examples represents the total amount of housing debt that borrower is allowed. So here's my logic. 36% minus 28% is 8%, correct? That means that if that borrower that means if that borrower has more than 8% in debt, it's going to drive down what they can borrow for a house PITI payment. There's that. So keep in mind, if they carry more than that 8, it's going to drive down their affordability for a house. The other side of it is, even if they carry no revolving debt, they've got no credit cards, no car payment, no student loans, 28% is still the max that can go towards a house payment. They can no longer borrow the whole 36, even though they're in great financial shape in terms of debt to income ratio. Does that make sense? So when I do these problems, here's what I do. I always take the gross monthly income. So if you got to divide it by 12 to get there, don't forget that step. But I always take the gross monthly income, and the first things I do is multiply by 36%, 0.36, or multiply by 28%, 0.28. Write those two numbers down. Then I read the question, probably now for the third time, and I look to see what debt they already carry. Credit card, car payment, any debt that they might have in the test question. And I add that together. Then I subtract that number from the 36% number. And if that number is less than the 28% number, that now represents their PITI. If I subtract that debt from the 36% number and it's higher than the 28% number, it doesn't matter because they can still only borrow the 28%. Does that help to just walk that through again? Where my logic and brain goes, Juliana, does that help? Take a look at that. I'm just checking on you because you seemed excited about the review. Just want to check on you. The other major thing is discount points. And I think you could have this multiple times. What I found with discount points is they're going to have you do more than one dismount, meaning you're going to have to calculate the debt to income ratio, you're going to have to calculate the loan to value, or you're going to have to read about the loan versus the appraised value, the purchase price versus the appraised value. You're going to have to do something to get there. But just remember, a discount point is 1% of the amount borrowed, not the purchase price, not the appraised value. It's 1% of the amount borrowed, borrowed, borrowed. I've probably said that 20,000 times in class, right? 1% of the amount borrowed. So if you got 3 discount points, it's 3%. Mortgage amortization. This, you will be given a chart. Especially if you go to the test center, they handed me one on nice cardstock. In the past, it's been laminated and taped to the desk. You will get this. My students that have audited from home and done the test from home said that they didn't get this and they didn't have any questions on it. When I went to the test center the last time to audit, they had it, they gave it to me. In the past, it's always been laminated, like I said, and taped to the desk. I ended up not needing to use it, but you will get it. So you do not need to memorize what's on page 85 for that mortgage factor chart. Okay. But here's what the factor chart does. It helps calculate the principal and interest payment on a loan. This chart is already, you like this word, algorithmed per $1,000 borrowed. It's fun to make up words. So what you'll do is you'll calculate the amount being borrowed. So again, an exam question may challenge you to be able to do that loan to value. You'll take the amount borrowed and you always divide it by 1,000. What I love about this is on this factor sheet on page 85 and the factor sheet I've seen at the exam center, it's always at the top said monthly payment per 1,000 of mortgage. Hot diggity damn, they just gave you a nugget. Right, Kim? Aren't they generous? Psychological Services Incorporated. So that right there, you got the hint. Always take the amount borrowed divided by 1,000. Then what's left, I call that units. I don't know if that's the best name for it. But if your amount borrowed is $200,000, divide by 1,000 is 200. That's what I'm calling units. Some of you have told me you just put an asterisk next to it to remember that's where you left off. I like that plan too. Then you're going to take the interest rate and the term of the loan. Remember, term means length. The term of the loan means the length of the loan. You're going to take the interest rate and the length of the loan and find the factor number. You'll multiply that factor number by the number of units that you calculated, and that will give your PI payment to you. Now, my guess is If you get one where you just need to give them the payment, bless your heart. I bet they're going to ask something more calculating, literally, where they want to know the difference between two payments. And I gave you an example of that on page 84. The other one that I tried to simulate for you on the bottom of 84 that we maybe didn't get to was they might ask you a question like, what is the longest length of a loan you could get and still keep your payment under $1,200? So you're going to have to calculate multiple years to see what's the longest I can have this loan and not have my payment go over X number of dollars. It might be a setup similar to that. Property taxes and prorating. Let me just hit on page 86, a mill rate. Remember that is a 1/1000th of a dollar. A percentage is 1/100th, but if 1/1000th is a mill. So if something were 18 mil, that would actually go into your calculator as 0.018. 0.018. I didn't come up with any of these terms. Tax proration might be another big rock for you. And at the bottom of page 86, review that accrued and prepaid. Because I think you could have a question about debt and credit on a closing disclosure. But knowing accrued and prepaid is going to help you answer math questions about how much money the buyer owes the seller or the seller owes the buyer. If the buyer owes the seller, it's prepaid. If the seller owes the buyer, it's accrued. Now let's do this quick review. On page 87, there are two different ways to calculate property taxes. There is the 360-day method and the 365-day method. They will tell you in the test question what they want you to use. The 360-day method, you take the annual tax, divide it by 12. That will give you a monthly rate. Then you take that number and divide by 30. That will give you a daily rate. You do not need to worry about the number of days in each month when you're doing your initial calculation assessment. It's divide by 12. It's divide by 30.
So is the answer divided by 12? Or is
the 360 method, you'll take the annual tax divided by 12. That's your monthly rate. You'll multiply that, Adrian, by the number of full months. And then you'll divide that monthly rate by 30. That will give you a daily rate. And then you can calculate that, the number of days into the month that you need. Because maybe you've got a month that's they're only owning it for the first 8 days. So you'd calculate 8 times that number of days. So that one is divide by 12, divide by 30.
so the annual tax rate you divide by you use both of them, or do you use the annual tax rate by 12?
Yep,
divide
annual
by
tax
12,
rate divide by 12, divide by 30. Yes.
Okay. You don't use the answer by 30 though, right?
No.
Okay.
Annual tax divide by 12.
Okay.
Then divide that by 30.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. I think I'm with you now. Sorry. The 365-day method, you're going to take the annual tax and divide by 365. That will give you a daily rate. But then keep in mind, you need to know, then now you do need to know how many days are in a month. So I gave you that rhyme. Some of you are using your knuckles, but I gave you the rhyme of 30 days, half September, April, June, and November. Those all have 30. All the rest have 31, except for February, which is weird. That's how I memorize it. And then what I do is on both of these methods, I've told you how to calculate them. On both of these methods, what I do is then I take and I calculate the amount of tax for when the seller lived there. January 1 until closing date. That's what the seller is responsible for. I always calculate that. Then I subtract that seller amount from the annual tax number. And what's left over represents what the buyer is responsible for, which is from closing date until the end of the year. Then I read the question about whether it's talking about accrued or prepaid. And then that lets me know whether the buyer owes the seller or the seller owes the buyer. Does that help break that down a little bit as well? Okay. Then last but not least, I gave you some additional math bonus. And I also gave you how to calculate it in your little cheat sheet that I spoiled you and gave you some answers, didn't I? No, I love spoiling you guys. Just keep in mind, you're probably going to have some math that seems out there, but just slow down and read the question. It's oftentimes that they're talking about John in the question, and then at the last minute, they want you to answer a question about Jeff. So just slow down and read the question. Otherwise, they might have you do some things that, unfortunately, I just won't be able to predict. Okay, let's wrap this up. That was your math.